Good morning. This is my video requirement for assignment 2H, New Testament History, Acts. First, I want to talk about the earliest features of the Jewish Christian community. They were originally known as followers of the Way, the Nazarenes, or more accurately, Nazareans. On 297, Bruce quotes a professor by the name of Mamagliano, who says this, and I quote, "Judaism was at once a faith and a people." This certainly would distinguish them from later Gentile believers who were many peoples. The earliest Jewish Christian community was made up of two main groups, the Hebrews and the Hellenists. Hebrews were those who were brought up in the traditional ways of Judaism, while Hellenists were those Jews who had some Greek influence in their culture and language. According to Bruce on 226, it is the Hellenist Jews who fled following the death of Stephen. The Jewish Christians were thought to have stayed put, as they could blend into the local Jewish community a bit easier. The scattering of these Hellenist believers actually would help spread the gospel. Bruce states on 206 that were it not for the resurrection event, there would have been no such thing as resurrection faith. The Jewish Christians were the first to practice this resurrection faith. They were the inheritors of the promised age of the Spirit. They were the inheritors of that which was foretold. In the Carson and Moo text on page 210, they describe that for decades, the Jewish church actually believed themselves to be the true remnant of Israel. We see a bit of this demonstrated in the superscription of the book of James, itself a very Jewish epistle. Understanding that they were convinced that they were the only ones holding down the true traditions of God probably makes it a bit easier for us to understand why they would have so much trouble embracing Gentile believers. We see Peter as having a leading role in these earliest Jewish Christian communities. He's the man where the heart of the action got started. He's the man in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, while Paul is the man for the Gentiles in every place from Syria to Rome. We see this described in the Carson and Moo text on page 286. We see there's plenty of opposition from the historical Jewish establishment, meaning that there was a somewhat uniform expectation of consistency being impressed on the early Jewish church from outside, from folks that still considered themselves true Jews compared to this strange movement of Jesus following Jews. This would have been somewhat different than what happened to the Gentile church. There would not have been a uniform pressure put on the Gentile church because they weren't a uniform people. Early Jewish Christians in the Jewish Christian community, according to Moo and Carson on 287, were full of loyal but unusual Jews. They were maintaining Jewish customs while at the same time proclaiming Jesus as Lord. They must have seemed like a peculiar people. So another feature, early Jewish Christians were, of course, suspicious of Gentile Christians. I don't think this was a uniquely Jewish Christian problem. This is something the church has faced throughout most of church history. Older generations of Christians seem to be suspicious of younger generations of Christians, especially if there are big cultural differences, and giant cultural differences were present in the first century church as they tried to figure out how to integrate. According to Bruce on 212, from the scriptures, the Jewish church recognized in Jesus a threefold purpose. This would have been somewhat different than the threefold purpose or any purpose that Gentile communities would have seen in Jesus. The threefold purpose that the early Jewish church saw was that Jesus was not only the promised Messiah, but he was Moses' promised prophet, and he was Isaiah's suffering servant. The earliest Jewish church saw Jesus as the fulfillment of every important promise. Let's talk for a couple minutes about the features of Gentile believers in later chapters of the book of Acts. So the Gentile world, which includes most Christians today, has in some small way Paul to thank for their conversion. Bruce says of Paul on page 336 the following, here's a quote, "His plan was always to preach Christ where his name had not been previously heard." The Gentile church comes on the scene in a major way in Cornelius, which interestingly enough was a result of Peter's work in his life, not Paul's. You would have thought, based on their mission interests and emphases, that it would have been Paul who led this Gentile to the Lord, but no, it was Peter the guy who went to the Jewish church in those first decades. The Gentile church actually shows up in a less prominent way before Cornelius, if you consider Philip's baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. Bruce describes that on page 230. Cornelius gets a bit more attention, I think, because it is the first public inclusion of Gentiles, whereas Philip sends the eunuch on his way. Cornelius had a much broader and more visible presence in the region. On 231 of the Bruce text, we learn that in Acts 11, we see the first large-scale evangelization of Gentiles taking place in Syria and Antioch under some unnamed guys from Cyprus and Cyrene. We're seeing that decentralization is beginning to occur. A major feature of the Gentile church is the question of where they're going to fit into the broader scheme of things, especially with the Jewish church. Bruce asks, for instance, on page 226, what are they going to do about circumcision? And if you read the book of Acts, you see this particular issue coming up over and over and over again. These two branches of the church are going to have a hard time integrating. So the term Christian, which comes from Christianos, servants of Christ, is first used of Christians at Antioch of Syria, where there was a substantial presence of Jewish Christians. Christians won't call themselves by this name until the 2nd century. In fact, the 3 times that this term is used in Scripture, according to Bruce, it is used by outsiders. Tensions begin to develop between Jewish Christians in Jerusalem and Gentile Christians in Antioch. On 269 and 270, Bruce recognizes that Paul and Barnabas cannot allow 2 factions of the church to take root, cannot allow 2 churches to emerge in this early movement. They have to figure out how to be unified, lest Paul has run in vain. The contribution from the church at Antioch to the church at Jerusalem during a time of famine likely eased the tensions between the largely Gentile and Jewish churches. But as Bruce points out on 271, some of the Jewish believers in Jerusalem probably interpreted this as some form of tribute. No good deed goes unpunished. As Paul traveled from place to place, he likely preached the gospel to far more Jews than Gentiles. We see this over and over again. He goes first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. But it seems that the Gentiles are more receptive to his message. The gospel going into Asia Minor means that there will be more and more Gentiles hearing the message. What does this mean? Soon there will be more Gentile than Jewish Christians. The language of the church is going to have to change to accommodate this, right? Plus the need to understand Jewish jargon, understand Jewish theological terms. This is going to have to change because it won't have any contextual meaning in Gentile communities. So many Gentiles with deep pagan roots start coming into the church that the need begins to arise for the training of new converts. They got to slow down for a minute to help them transition from their old way of life so that they don't import those old ways into their new way of thinking. Thanks very much.